2024年9月17日。今日は、モダル PLLC のブライアン・エプスタイン先生と、私、グローリア国際知財事務所の橋爪で共催のセミナーを行います。よろしくお願いします。So let me introduce Mr. Brian Epstein shortly. He is from United States. He is a United States patent attorney. He is good at patent prosecution. He is good at patent infringement cases, and he loves Japan pretty much. So he comes to Japan about 3 or 4 times a year.
そうですね。橋爪グロヤさんbegan her career as a translator. She later became a benrishi. She focuses mostly in chemical cases. However, she also has experience in both mechanical as well as electrical and software patent applications. She recently began her own firm in April of this year. And I don't know. And that's about it.
Oh, thank you for introducing me. では始めます。どうぞ。
はい、ありがとう。So today's topic is U.S. patent portfolio management. So to begin with, sometimes I receive a question from non-U.S. applicants where they conduct their own research and ask whether they should follow the same strategies that U.S. applicants follow. And generally the answer is no. U.S. applications from other countries, such as Japan, are in a procedurally different position when they enter the U.S. For example, as compared to a application that was originally drafted for the U.S. application. In particular, these non-U.S. origin cases were drafted in a different language for different examination procedures, such as at the JPAA. And so to turn the question around, should U.S. applicants follow the same procedure as Japanese applicants at the JPAA? And the answer there is of course not, right? Again, when we're entering the JPAA, our applications are in a procedurally different position. So the purpose of today's seminar is that I believe that Japanese applicants can be much more successful at the USPTO with just a little information and some small changes to their strategies. どうぞ。
ブライアン先生によりますと、アメリカからの出願じゃない出願は、その米国からの出願とは全然審査過程とかが違うので、もちろんのことですが、日本の出願の審査過程ではなく、アメリカ用の審査過程に従った方法で出願するのがおすすめということです。そうすることによって、より成功した風に出願を取り進めることができます。で、そのためにちょっと小さな変化を加えるだけでいいので、それを学びましょうということです。どうぞ。
So today's topics will include an introduction to the USPTO account system. We'll look at some strategies like always arguing the first action on the merits, whether or not to file an RCE. We'll look at a strategy involving a preliminary amendment, and then we'll conclude with interviews. どうぞ。
はい。目次ですが、USPTO のカウントシステムについてご紹介いただき、次に、最初のオフィスアクションのメリット、ファーストアクション on merits にいつも、反論する必要があるかどうか、それから RCE はする必要があるか、それからプレリミナリーアメントメントについて、それから、審査官とのインタビューについてご説明いただきます。
はい。So, sorry, PowerPoint's acting strange. Hey, what's going on?
Oh, is it okay?
Well, I'll tell you in a second.
Okay.
I'll have to edit this portion out. No, it's not. What's going on?
So PC has something wrong?
There it goes. Okay.
Okay.
So, USPTO examiners must work a certain number of hours each year. I don't know the number off the top of my head. I think it's like 2,000 hours. And these hours come from two main sources. First, production time, which is they receive by examining patent applications, as well as other time, which they receive by receiving training, conducting interviews with attorneys, and writing advisory actions. And there is a technology-specific formula that dictates how many hours are received for examining an application. For example, they have this thing called counts, and historically one count was equivalent to one office action. And one count might yield 5 hours of production time in a mechanical field, or 10 hours of production in a software field. You know, I don't know the numbers. It is publicly available though, I believe. And there are other factors as well, such as the number of claims, but their interaction with these numbers is far more complicated. どうぞ。
はい。USPTO の審査官たちは毎年働かなきゃいけない時間とかが決められているそうです。例えば何時間かわかんないんですけど、2000時間とかそういうのが決められています。で、なんかそれらの、時間っていうのは2つのソースから来ています。まずそれを作るための生産時間と、それと他の時間、例えばトレーニングにかかった時間とか、それからインタビューに用いた時間とか、アドバイザリーアクションを出すのに要した時間とかは考慮されます。それで、そのカウントシステムというのが審査官には適用されているようで、例えば機械分野だと5時間働くごとになんか1個カウントがついて、でソフトウェアだと、10時間ごとに1カウントがつくとか、そういうなんか働いた程度を評価するためのカウントシステムがあります。
So now in more contemporary times, counts are based on the stage of prosecution. For example, based on prosecution stage, examiners can receive between 25 to 125% of the standard credit of one count per office action. And even if a low credit office action is low quality, the product's quality is unlikely to be challenged by USPTO management or by the applicant, right? Well, why is that, Brian? USPTO management mainly reviews allowances, not rejections. Further, applicants can only challenge via appeal, which is expensive. And the significance is that if an examiner avoids a challenge, by progressing to the next stage of prosecution, the examiner can sometimes receive 50 to 200% of the standard credit. どうぞ。
はい。カウントシステムは審査のステージによってカウント数がどんどん上がっていくようなシステムになっています。で、審査のステージでは審査官は、標準となるクレジットの、およそ 25% から 125% の、カウントを得ることができます。で、なんか、低いクレジットのオフィスアクションの場合、低い品質のものでも、なんか USPTO の、マネージメントとか出願人からそれについてなんか挑戦というか、それが正しいかどうかのチャレンジがされることがあまりありません。で、なんか USPTO のマネージメント側は、拒絶がされた場合ではなく、許可がされた場合になんかそれが正しかったかどうかのチェックをします。で、それで、はい、どうぞ。
はい。So on this slide, you can see an example of the count system. This information is publicly available. It looks a little bit different in its official form, partly because the original one was drafted for political reasons. So I've changed the names for clarity. As you can see, in the first round of prosecution, there's a first action on the merits, a final office action, and then what we call a disposal. Disposals are abandonments, allowances, RCEs, and examiners' answers to appeal briefs. And the important thing on this slide are in the colors, right? So the very first office action, which is, almost always a non-final, that receives 125% of the standard credit. The next important thing is the final office actions. These only receive 25% of the standard credit. And then the final one to pay attention to is this RCE. And in this case, we're looking at both the disposal itself as well as the subsequent office action. And here, the applicant receives 150% of the standard credit because the RCE necessarily results in a subsequent non-final office action. And if in the case of this non-final office action being an allowance, the examiner would receive an extra 0.5 counts for disposal as well. So allowing a case upon the filing of the first RCE results in 2 total counts for the examiner. どうぞ。
そうですね、カウントシステムを色分けしてブライアン先生が示してくれています。一番最初のファーストアクションの場合には 1.25 のカウントが付与されます。で、ファイナルの場合に 0.25。で、ディスポーザル、その放棄された時には 0.5% というカウントがそれぞれ与えられます。で、RC に進んだ場合には、アディショナルの、カウントが付与されるということになります。だから 150%、その通標準よりも 150% のクレジットが審査官に付与されることになります。
はい。So the USPTO awards counts to examiners when prosecution advances to the next stage. So an examiner receives 0 counts if the examiner cannot advance prosecution to the next stage. For example, if an examiner withdraws an office action and issues another non-final office action, prosecution remains at the current stage. There's no counts given for the subsequent office action. In addition, as long as the examiner can maintain the final office action, as long as she doesn't withdraw it, she will eventually receive 0.5 counts. But these counts might require additional work depending on what the applicant does and the fact that the examiner loses control of when those counts are received. So although on the previous slide, these 0.5 counts seem related to the final office action, they're better considered part of the next transaction. どうぞ。
はい。USPTO は、審査官に今まで説明したようなカウントを、与えるのですけれども、それは次のステージに審査が進んだ時に与えられます。だから審査官は、次の過程に審査を進めることができなかったらカウント何ももらえなく0カウントのままなわけです。で、その審査官が最後の OA を維持することができた場合には、その審査官は、0.5 カウントを得ることができるのです。
はい。So if the examiner allows an application at non-final, instead of issuing a final office action, at final, instead of issuing a final office action, she will receive 0.75 counts. 0.25 for performing an examination at the final stage, as well as 0.5 for the disposal. If the examiner instead issues the final office action, she will receive 0.25 counts immediately, right, for the final, And an additional 0.5 counts when the applicant takes action, for example, abandonment or RCE. And of course, the independent claims usually are amended when we file RCEs. So you can see that there's this interest in I've lost it. I don't remember what I'm trying to say here. Whatever, we'll edit that out. Okay. So if an examiner immediately allows a case after the RCE, she can then receive 200% of the standard credit, right? She gets 0.25 for the final that was issued. She receives 1 count for the non-final examination, right? It's on a non-final rejection, it's the non-final office action, and 0.5 for the non-final office action being an allowance or disposal. So you can see that examiners want to allow cases at the time of non-final rather than at the final office action. どうぞ。
今3つのケースを示してもらったんですが、最初のケースでは、審査官は、最後の OA を与える代わりにその出願を許可したような場合、その場合はその審査官は 0.75 カウントを得ることになります。で、一方で審査官が、最後の OA を出した後に、出すと 0.25 カウントを得られて、その後、もし出願人が何かアクション、例えば RCE を提出するとかそういうことをしたら、また 0.5 カウントがプラスして審査官に与えられます。で、最後の場合は審査官は、RCE の後に、200%、標準の 200% のクレジットを得るんですが、その後、ノンファイナルのフィクスアクションの前にすぐに、許可をした場合には、一番たくさんクレジットを得ることができるので、これを審査官が、これを目指すことが多いようです。
Okay. So, you know, the point of the previous slide was that examiners would rather issue a final office action rather than allow the application of final. And so now we can expect 3 things. Because examiners receive few counts for final OAs and no counts for the advisory action, right? They receive additional hours. They typically do not care much about the quality of the final office action. In particular, supervisory examiners care about final office action quality only relative to appeal, in my experience. That is, if the supervisor believes the applicant will not appeal the case, then the supervisor does not care about the quality of the office action. Next, because examiners receive fewer counts for final OAs than non-final OAs, examiners prefer allowing cases at the non-final OA, right? That was my point at the beginning of this slide. And because independent claims are typically narrowed with an RCE, an examiner can push the applicant to amend a probably allowable claim to a more clearly allowable claim. And this point is significant because the examiner should have allowed this claim already. However, again, USPTO management focuses on reviewing allowances, not office actions. And so our examiner can feel safer if there's one more amendment prior to this allowance. どうぞ。
はい。3つのことについて予期できるという話をしてもらいました。審査官は、そうですね。あまり最後の拒絶理由の品質については、典型的にはあまり気にしないということでした。審査官の上司は、care about、最後の拒絶理由の品質ではなく、審判に行った場合についてのみ 注意を払ってるということでした。で、審査官は、最後の拒絶理由についてはあまりカウントを得ることができないので、その最後の拒絶理由ではない OA のタイミングで許可をすることを好みます。で、RC に進むと、一般的には、補正がされてより狭いクレームになりますので、そっちの方が安心なんで、審査官はそっちの方に持っていこうとする傾向があります。
Alright, so let's look at some potential strategies, beginning with always arguing the first action on the merits. So some background is that if the applicant takes more actions during prosecution, such as amending and arguing, the examiner can feel safer about an allowance, okay? This is absolutely true. It shows the examiner's boss that the examiner tried to reject the claim. It limits the scope of the reissue application. You know, examiners don't really like allowing cases on the first office action. And in addition, you know, it's possible that any action will put the case in condition for allowance. And as a result of these two things, many non-US attorneys, including Japanese benrishi, but especially European and Chinese attorneys, and some US attorneys always argue the first action on the merits rather than amend. And a department head at a major US patent firm once urged me to do it as a great way to make money. On the other hand, I've heard examiners say the intention of the first action on the merits is to convince the applicant to, quote, come back with your real set of claims, right? The examiners don't believe that the initial set of claims is reasonable. どうぞ。
はい。出願金は、審査の過程において、もっとなんかアクションを取ってほしいわけですね。すぐに許可を得るのはあまり安全ではないので、より多くのアクションを、経て許可を得ようとします。で、アメリカのアトーニーや、アメリカの、代理人たちはよく一番最初のオフィスアクションに対して反論することを進めたりとかするのですが、なんかそれは必ずしもいいわけではないようだということでした。そういうふうに最初のオフィスアクションから反論してしまうと、よりお金がかかってコストがかかるだけだという場合も多いです。
はい。So in this slide, you can see a timeline. So what's the point in the examiner issuing a first action on the merits only to then allow the case, right? That's the question I would ask these people. If the examiner believed the original claims were allowable, they could simply issue a quail action instead of issuing an action on the merits. And if the examiner did not believe the original claims were allowable, then the examiner looks bad allowing the original claims without another rejection. So an argument against a first action on the merits isn't likely to result in an allowance. どうぞ。
はい。一番最初のオフィスアクションに対してすぐに許可が出るっていうことは、どういう場合かっていう話をしてもらったんですけども、最初から許可可能性がある場合にはおそらくクエイルアクションっていうのが出されるでしょうということでした。で、審査官が、最初に提出されたクレームが許可されるべきものではないと考えた場合には、それに対して何も拒絶理由を通知することなく許可してしまうのはすごい悪いことだと審査官は考えるようです。
はい。 So the advantage of waiting to allow a case until after applicant responds is very small for the examiners. It's an additional 0.25 counts. Further, a final office action rebutting applicants' arguments is basically the same as the first action on the merits, but with a short response to arguments section in many cases, as if you argue rather than amend. And after a final office action, an examiner can expect an RCE with claim amendments. どうぞ。
審査官が、最初のオフィスアクションに対して、何か発行する場合というのはどういう場合かというと、なんかすごく小さなカウント 0.25 カウントしか、もらえないわけですね。さらに、最後のオフィスアクションにとって、反論をするっていうのは、最初のオフィスアクションに対して反論するのと同じなんですけれども、short response to argument section。その反論のセクションに対してより小さなレスポンスで済みます。そして、最後の OA の後には、その RCE とともにクレームの補正がされることが、審査官にとっては予期されます。
Right. So when arguments against the first action on the merits are unsuccessful, prosecution closes, right? There's a final office action. And then the only way to ensure an amendment is considered is to file an RCE. It's possible for an examiner to consider it in other situations, but it's not ensured. In this situation, presenting a US-specific claim set requires at least two office action responses and an RCE, right? It requires your first office action, which was a arguments. And now your examiner is not going to enter your claims until you file the RCE, so that's the second response. At typical US attorneys' rates, I don't know, this total cost is going to be more than $6,000 probably. And paying $6,000 to have your examiner consider US-specific claims for the first time is far too much money, right? Some US applicants pay that much for drafting the entire patent application. Ben-Rishi drafting rates might be even lower. In addition, in this situation, we have now filed an RCE. And so, you know, the USPTO charges an increasing amount of money based on how many RCEs are filed. And so if this application now requires a future RCE, the cost for that RCE has increased. どうぞ。
はい。その、一番最初の、オフィスアクションに対して、反論をしてそれがうまくいかなかった場合、その審査が終わってしまいます。で、補正を確保するためには RCE を提出することを検討するしかなくなってしまいます。しかし、そうするにはすごいお金がかかってしまいます。$6000 US ドラぐらいかかってしまうので、それはあまりにもコストが高くなってしまいますね。それだったら、そうですね。We have now filed。いや、だからそれはちょっと高すぎるから、どうしましょうっていう話でした。
はい。So the recommendation is in your current practice, please do not always argue the first action on the merits. In addition, please be skeptical when your U.S. attorney suggests arguing the first action on the merits. I try to argue maybe 40% of my first actions. And by that, I mean that when I conduct an interview on the first action on the merits, I do not present any amendments only 40% of the time. And then my examiners usually convince me during the interview that an amendment is necessary. So resultingly, I actually argue the first action on the merits may be 20% or less of the time. どうぞ。
はい。だからまずブライアン先生のおすすめによると、いつも、ファーストアクションオンメリッツに対していつも反論を試みるのはおすすめではありませんということでした。ブライアン先生のご経験によりますと、当初ブライアン先生はその 40% ぐらいのケースでそのファーストアクションオンメリッツに対してなんか反論を試みていたんですけれども、それ以降なんかいろいろやり取りをしていく過程でそんなにしてもあまりなんか意味がないことに気づいて、今ではその 20% かそれ以下の場合しか反論しなくなりました。
Right. So the next strategy we're going to consider is not filing an RCE. So in this slide, you can see a typical U.S. prosecution timeline, especially for non-U.S. origin applications, such as a Japanese application. And you'll notice that, or you'll remember that there is no governmental fee for the applicant to file a first action on the merits, response to the first action on the merits, and typically no fee for the final response itself. There is, of course, a governmental fee for the RCE, and therefore some applicants don't file RCEs. どうぞ。
はい。そうですね。ここに示したグラフは典型的な、アメリカの、審査のタイムラインを示したもので、特にそのアメリカからではない、例えば日本からの出願の流れを示したものです。で、そのファーストアクションオンメリッツに対する応答とか、最後の応答の場合には、その、ガバメンタルフィー、その政府に対して払うべきフィーは特にありません。しかし RCE の場合にはそういうのが発生します。だからこそ出願人は、RCE を、提出することを選ばない場合があります。
Right. So of course, initially not filing an RCE appears to make sense, right? Like I said, most after final responses do not require a governmental fee. And we discussed back on slide 7 how applicants are unlikely to file an appeal to challenge the examiner. So if we don't appeal or file an RCE, that must mean that we are abandoning. どうぞ。
はい。それで、スライド7でも示したように、出願人は、審査官の、審査結果に対して挑戦するために、審判を提出したりすることはあまりありません。だから、RCE を提出しないとか審判をしないということにより、それによりその出願が放棄されて終わってしまいます。
はい。Brian, please slow down. There are many after final responses other than appeal and RCE, right? Pre-appeal brief to ka, AFCP to ka, request for reconsideration. Why are you ignoring those? Do you not know how to use them? The value of these other after final responses is in how they relate to appeal and or RCE rather than on their own merits. For example, a request for reconsideration can produce an advisory action which helps clarify the examiner's position for an appeal or for an amendment. Or an after final amendment can show how the examiner will judge the effectiveness of those amendments.
でもブライアン先生、ちょっと待ってください。他にもそのアフターファイナルに対する応答方法はいろいろあるでしょっていう話をしてました。その審判や RC だけではなく、他にもいろいろあるでしょっていう話をしてました。でも例えばその、Request for Reconsideration 再審査請求とか、アドバイザリーアクション、それによるとアドバイザリーアクションを得ることができますよねって。 また、最後の補正に対して、審査官は、それらの補正の妥当性についてもう一回検討することができますよねという話をしてました。
Right. So these other procedures are great for producing useful information, but they are not effective tools for producing allowances. And if we know we're not appealing and we know we're not amending, then the only positive outcome is an allowance. So if we will not file an RCE, the only recommended response is filing arguments, or equivalently, including a dependent claim verbatim in the independent claim. This is the only response that the examiner must consider after final, okay? All of the other ones have some level of discretion associated with them or ineffectiveness associated with them. And I file these types of responses maybe 5 times per year. And I would estimate that they are effective maybe once or twice a year. And I do not believe my success rate would increase if I would simply file more of these responses, right? These are just not very effective, but they're the only thing you can do. どうぞ。
先に示した他のアフターファイナルのいろんな戦略があるという紹介はしましたけれども、それらはあまりその特許に対して許可を得るために有効な風になることはあまりないです。その審判に行かないし補正もしない場合には、その建設的なやり方と、してはやっぱ RCE を提出するしか、それか反論するしかないでしょうって。でそれか、なんかそのもう文言通りに、従属クレームを付加するぐらいしかないです。でブライアン先生は1年に5回ぐらいそういう風なやり方を選ぶことがありますけれども、それらが有効に機能する場合っていうのはまあ1年に 1,2 回あるかないかということで、それが増えることはあまり考えにくいということでした。
はい。So as a result, this decision to not file RCEs leads to ineffective responses for 2 reasons. Either these responses are not requests for reconsideration and therefore will not be considered, or they are requests for reconsideration, which are rarely successful. In addition, beyond simply filing these ineffective responses, my concern is that examiners will notice this unconventional strategy to not file RCEs. I mean, in particular, examiners will definitely notice if they do not receive RCEs from a particular applicant. どうぞ。
だから RCE を提出しないっていうのはなんかあまり有効じゃない応答を、招いてしまう可能性があります。ですね、そのあまり有効じゃない応答をすることによるブライアン先生の懸念事項っていうのは、その審査官がなんかその出願人が RCE を提出しない傾向にあるということをなんか気づいてしまうような、そういうことがあるかもしれないということでした。
はい。That is, examiners for such an applicant can be certain their actions will never be challenged by appeal, and these examiners will never need to reevaluate their rejections due to an RCE. And so as a result, we can expect that examiners will issue even worse final office actions, right? You're not going to appeal because it's expensive and time consuming. And if you never file an RCE, they'll never be asked to reconsider the outstanding rejection, right? The prosecution just ends. So the question is then, Brian, wouldn't they prefer, wouldn't the examiner prefer an allowance to a low quality final office action? yes, I mean, under the count system, that is true. However, USPTO management focuses review on allowances, not on office actions. So there's much lower risk to issuing the final office action as opposed to issuing an allowance. And unlike patent agents and patent attorneys, examiners don't run out of work if applicants abandon many cases, right? If I do it, you'll take your cases and go to a different law firm, or you'll stop filing. But if an examiner abandons your case, they'll just get another case. And in this situation, either the examiner does not care that you abandon the case, or much more likely, they're happy that you abandon the case. どうぞ。
審査官はその出願人があんまり RC を提出しない傾向にある人だって気づいちゃったら、なんかもう一回その拒絶の内容についてもう一回再評価するっていうようなことはしなくなってしまったりとかしてしまいます。だから審査官は、もっと良くないもっと劣悪な、最後の OA を出すようになるかもしれない。でもなんか、ブライアン先生、彼らは、品質の悪い拒絶を、拒絶の応援に対して許可をするでしょうか。いやどうでしょう。でも USPTO の、マネージャーたちは、許可されたものについてレビューすることはありますけれども、オフィスアクションの内容についてレビューすることはあまりないですっていうことでした。
はい。So Brian, are you just going to spend the day talking about other people's strategies, or will you try to propose your own? So I will try to convince you to file preliminary amendments to address both of these problems. So here you can see a typical timeline, and I've got the preliminary amendment showing, and I've proposed this strategy before, and people say, Brian, our applicant views a preliminary amendment as an unnecessary expense. Well, to me, I think that's strange, right? I think that examiners exploiting the count system to receive additional unnecessary amendments and RCEs is an unnecessary expense to the applicant. And my point is not that there are just simply many unnecessary expenses in USPTO prosecution, but rather that by filing a preliminary amendment, it becomes possible to avoid the examiner issuing a weak final office action. どうぞ。
はい。じゃあ、出願人は、ブライアン先生、その出願人は、そのプレリミナリーアメンドメントがあまりなんか必要性感じないって言ってることがあります。ね、そうでしょっていう話をしてましたが、ブライアン先生にとってはそれはとってもなんか変に聞こえるっていうことでした。なんかその審査官はそのカウントシステムを利用してなんかもっとたくさんの、補正をさせたり RCE を提出させたりとかしようとしてるんだと。だからブライアン先生のご意見によるとプレリミナリーアメンドメントを提出することによってなんかあまりなんか弱いあまり説得力のないファイナル OA が出されてしまうことを回避することができるのでより有効に活用できるのではないかということでした。
All right, so this slide is a little complicated, okay? You can see on the top that there's a timeline for a typical US prosecution, and on the bottom we have a timeline including a preliminary amendment. At the end of this, and you can see that there's kind of this time shift, right, where we file the preliminary amendment and the quality of the claims is similar to the first action on the merits without a preliminary amendment, right? We're addressing indefiniteness rejections, we're overcoming claim objections, we're adding dependent claims if possible. And you can see that this forward-looking amendment is, proceeds throughout the prosecution. So then we look at the gray and we can see that the final office action response without the preliminary amendment is similar to the first action on the merits response with the preliminary amendment. And then the blue non-final response without a preliminary amendment is similar to a blue final response with the preliminary amendment. Well, what happens now? Let's say the claim in the top prosecution. Let's say the claim is 51% allowable at this stage. The examiner now has a choice whether to allow the case or to reject it. The examiner can examine the case for 0.25 counts and determine it is allowable for 0.5 counts. So, the examiner receives 0.75 counts total to have management review an allowance of his 51% allowable claim. Right? It's probably allowable, they get 0.75 counts. Or, the examiner can examine and reject this case for 0.25 counts. The applicant will respond with a further amendment. We're going to say that makes the claim 60% allowable, right? It's a narrower claim now. The examiner will not enter that amendment, so the applicant must file an RCE. The examiner will receive 0.5 counts for the RCE. They will now examine the already allowable claim for 0.75 counts, right? We already said it's 51% allowable. Now it's 60% allowable. It's already allowable. And then the examiner will allow the case for an additional 0.5 counts. So in total, the examiner will receive 2 full counts to have management review an allowance of a 60% allowable claim, okay? That is, the examiner can receive an extra 1.25 counts by issuing an unnecessary final office action here, all right? So the examiner issues the final office action, and thus, if you look at the top, you can see that between the first action on the merits, the final office action, the non-final OA, and that's new final OA, the examiner has issued 4 office actions. Do you want to catch up? どうぞ。
わかりました。まず、その2つの、棒グラフを見せてもらってるんですけれども、1つ目の前段の方はプレリミナリーアメンドメントをしなかった場合の過程で、後段のやつはプレリミナリーアメンドメントを最初にした場合の過程で、プレリミナリーアメンドメントを含めた場合には、その審査過程が前方へちょっとシフトするっていうことで、その前段の方ではファイナルオフィスアクションが最後に出されて終わってるんですけど、これだとあまりカウント数が得られないんですけども、プレリミナリーアメンドメントから始めた場合には、その RCE が出されて、RCE 後にその許可率が 60% に上がったやつについて審査がされて終わるので、その審査官はよりたくさんのクレジットを得ることができます。だからこっちがこっちを選ばれる場合が多いという話でした。
はい。So what about with a preliminary amendment? Here, you would expect the examiner to issue 3 office actions, right? What would be the response to the final office action is now a response to the non-final office action, right? However, here, the examiner has already received 0.5 counts for this RCE. She will receive 1 count for examining the case at this stage, and if she determines it is allowable, she will receive 0.5 more counts. That is, she can receive 2 counts if she allows the case. Oops. So yes, at this stage, the claim is still only 51% allowable, so she might receive strict review from her supervisors. Still, the examiner only receives an additional 0.25 counts here for delaying prosecution. It is much less effective to play this sort of count game here than to simply allow the case and examine a new different case. どうぞ。
RCE を出してから許可を出すことによって、その RCE を出した時にもまだその特許に対して許可を出した時にもダブルで審査官はそのカウントを得ることが できるのですね。だからこれなんかカウントを取るためのゲームみたいなんですけど、そうやってなんかカウント化石を審査官はしていることが多々あるようです。
So this is the real value of a preliminary amendment, okay? Yes, sometimes allowance is shifted forward by only one office action. We will soon discuss why I believe it's still worthwhile in that situation. However, sometimes, because of the count system, allowance is sometimes shifted forward by 2 office actions and an RCE. This is unquestionably worthwhile, right? The examiner might issue only 2 office actions, right? On the bottom on the bottom timeline, you can see the first section on the merits, the final office action, and then the allowance itself. This is unquestionably worthwhile. You know, you're saving a full office action, you're saving the money for an RCE, and because this simply comes down to a coin flip, in the sense of like, was it allowed in an even number of office actions or an odd number of office actions? I expect this situation to occur something like 50% of the time. Could
you explain that again, please?
Sure. So at the top, because there's this final office action, you now have to file an RCE to continue prosecution, right? The examiner has told you it's not allowable. But at the bottom, you already have that same, it's not the same RCE, but you're in the procedurally similar place of having just filed an RCE, which is where your examiner wants to allow the case. And so instead of playing this game by issuing another final office action, she just allows it. Because the whole point is that the claim is already allowable, right? It's 51% allowable. And then the top, she can just say like, okay, well, if I just issue this final office action, then I can receive 2 counts. I'm sorry, let me make sure this is correct. I can receive 1.25 counts by issuing an unnecessary final. But if she allows it on time here, she receives 2 counts. So there's not a benefit. I mean, she could issue an extra non-final office action here, but she's not going to. She would rather get the 2 counts now and get a new case, because that will have, the first action on the merits is 1.25. She gets more counts for examining that case. But up here, she doesn't receive them, right? So it's actually to her benefit to, because this is that same 1.25 as a new case. It's easier to examine this case again than to examine a new case. And so in the top situation, it's to her advantage to play the game. In the bottom situation, just allow it and get the next case. And so the point is that, again, the substance of the response is almost identical, right? The whole point is that this non-final response in blue is the same as the final response in blue at the bottom. But because of when they were submitted, you get a different outcome, right? In the top, instead of receiving an allowance, you get a final office action. And in the bottom, because the blue one is submitted with an RCE, you receive your allowance then. You never receive this, what would be the yellow office action, because you instead receive an allowance based on the exact same claims.
わかりました。その同じクレームの場合であったとしても、この前段の場合には、ノンファイナルのオフィスアクションが出てから、その後、最後のその拒絶が確定して終わってしまうのですけれども、そうじゃなくて、同じクレームでも公団の場合には最後の拒絶理由が通知されてから、その後 RC が提出されて、この時にカウントが付与されて審査官に。で、その後その RC 後の補正されたクレームに対して許可がされたら、 RCE の時とその許可された時とのダブルで、審査官にはカウントが手に入って、よりよくそのゲームを プレイしてることになりますし、この方が公団の方が時間かからないので、次の案件を審査官はもらえることになるし、その審査官にとっては公団の方が断然優位になるようです。
はい。So the question then is, Brian, do examiners really knowingly issue weak final office actions? 本当に？確かに。An examiner who is a friend of mine but not someone in front of whom I represent clients told me he does it. And, based on my experience with other examiners, I have found that to be correct. And the point is that the cost for this unnecessary Fourth Amendment, right, because it's, a non-final, a final, a non-final, and a final, might be $4,500. It's your attorney fee for the office action response, plus your government fee for the second RCE. So if it is truly possible to avoid this situation simply by filing a preliminary amendment, there is a large cost savings, right? I mean, $4,500 is an extraordinary cost for a preliminary amendment.
わかりました。ブライアン先生に、次の、した質問は、本当に審査官はあまり説得力のない OA だって最後の拒絶理由だって知りながらそういうのを出してるんですかねっていう話をしてて、で、ブライアン先生の知り合いの審査官によると確かにそういうことやってますよっていう話を聞いたことがあります。で、ブライアン先生がこれまでにした審査官のやり取りでも確かにそういう傾向が読み取れたっていうことでした。で、プレリミナリーアメンドメントをすることで不必要な補正に$4,500 US ドルをかけることを、回避することができるのだったらコスト的にもそっちの方が良いのではないかという話をされていました。
All right, Brian, you have our attention now. What benefits can we expect to achieve with a preliminary amendment? Well, first, your attorney must read the specification, okay? I often explain that U.S. attorneys generally do not read the specification. I don't know how they're going to write a suitable preliminary amendment without reading the specification. Maybe they can just copy the claims to new claim sets, different statutory classes. But if they're going to draft U.S. specific claims, they have to look at the specification. Secondly, you are paying your attorney to read the specification. This is a good thing, okay? We're not trying to punish our attorney to make them do extra work. We're trying to incentivize them to do the job we want them to do. When there's an office action, the U.S. attorney is being evaluated on their ability to overcome the office action, not on their ability to understand the specification or the invention. On the other hand, in a preliminary amendment, the U.S. attorney can focus on understanding the invention and claiming it effectively. Third, your attorney can prepare a claim set specific for U.S. examination, okay? By that I mean 3 independent claims and about 20 total claims. I sometimes talk about how even bad dependent claims can serve as guideposts for prosecution. More dependent claims means more options for efficient prosecution. Fourth, your examiner reviews the amended claims at the first action on the merit stage when the examiner receives the most counts for doing their work, okay? This is your best opportunity to have the examiner fully consider the subject matter of those 20 total claims. If you do it in response to the non-final office action, your examiner is only going to get 0.25 counts for the final office action to consider these claims. The consideration will not be as thorough. It's better to submit these claims early. Fifth, your attorney should sometimes be able to write claims that are indicated as allowable in the first action on the merits. How do I know this is possible? Because I did it for a Kansai-based applicant, okay? You can completely produce allowable subjects, not all the time, but sometimes you can produce allowable subject matter without even having seen an office action. どうぞ。
思いました。 ではプリリミナリーアメンドメントをすることでどういうふうな、良いことがあるでしょうっていう話を、5つ挙げてもらいました。第一に、プリリミナリーアメンドメントを提出することによって、代理人さんが明細書を読んでくれるようになります。一般的にその米国代理人さんは出願するときに明細書をなんかあんまり読み込んだりせずにそのクレームだけ見て提出しちゃうことが多いんですけど、そういうことを防ぐことができます。第2に、第2も同じですね。その、代理人に明細書を読むように促すことができて、第3に、クレームセットを十分な数だけ用意することができます。3つの独立クレームと全部でその20個前後の従属クレームも含めたクレームを用意することができ、それによってよりたくさんの審査の機会、どんな内容だと許可可能になるかの審査結果をより多く得ることができます。第4に、審査官はファーストアクションメリットのステージで、その補正クレームを、見直すことができて、それによって多くのカウント数を得ることができます。で、最後に、代理人は、あまりよくあることではないんですけども、プリリミナリーアメンドメントをすることによってなんか補正のする必要のないそのまま特許になるようなクレームを用意することができる場合もありえます。
Right. All right, Brian. Well, what do American applicants think about this proposal? Remember, for them, we draft the original applications. And I told you at the beginning they're in a procedurally different position when we begin U.S. prosecution. So there's generally no need for preliminary amendments for American applicants at the USPTO. Demo. American clients seem to more frequently receive indications of allowable subject matter in the first action on the merits, right? The claims are drafted for U.S. practice. Next, American clients typically allow us to file the first RCE without explicit authorization, okay? The significance here is that they view U.S. prosecution as a group of transactions rather than as individual piecemeal transactions, right? They see the whole thing, they want to get the whole case allowed faster. They're not worried about, each individual office action and its response as much as just completing the entire prosecution. And they often permit voluntary amendments in Europe. This is going to depend on their current budget, but I would say they permit voluntary amendments a little bit more than 50% of the time because it does reduce costs. Having a jurisdiction-specific set of claims helps avoid unnecessary office actions in that jurisdiction. So I think that, a typical American applicant, if they were looking at a non-US origin case coming into the United States, they would want to file a preliminary amendment here. どうぞ。
ではブライアン先生、アメリカの出願人はこういう提案についてどう思うのでしょう。彼らにとっては、最初にそのアメリカの人が、ドラフトを作るのだから、彼らにとってはプリリミナリーアメンドメントってあんまり必要なものじゃないんですね。しかしアメリカのクライアントにとっても一番最初のファーストアクションオンメリットでプリリミナリーアメンドメントを挟むことによってよりなんか許可可能っていう風に示唆されることが多くなります、アメリカ人にとっても。で、アメリカのクライアントにとって明示の認可がされる ことなく最初の RCE を提出することが認められる場合があります。それで、これは、アメリカの審査が、全体として評価されるものであって、断片的にその審査の過程が見られるものではないということを示しています。で、プレリミナリーアメンドメントを挟むことに、よって、そのヨーロッパでもなんか同様の自発補正をするようにして、で、審査の過程を縮めて効率よく進めることができます。
はい。So let's talk about interviews. I frequently discuss how American applicants typically ask us to interview every office action. Okay. It's reasonable to assume that American applicants request interviews because they see value in doing so. For example, in a cost savings over time. But I also know that Japanese companies sometimes approach expenses more conservatively. So let me tell you how I would handle this situation if I were working at a Japanese company. どうぞ。
はい。ブライアン先生は次にインタビューについてお話しすると言ってます。ブライアン先生にとってはその全てのオフィスアクションの過程でインタビューをするっていうのがとても意味のある大事なことだと、話されていました。そうですね、そういう、インタビューを毎回実施することにはそれなりの意味があるということでした。
はい。So one applicant that requires interviews also pays a very low interview fee, maybe 50% of the typical fee. And the equivalent time charge is basically consumed by scheduling the interview and sending the agenda for the interview. And accordingly, U.S. attorneys have told me they basically will not participate in interviews for this applicant because we have already met the time charge, right? That's all the time the applicant is paying for. We did we scheduled the interview, we wrote the agenda, we sent the agenda, that's it. But if we do not conduct an interview at all, the applicant asks us to explain why. Okay, in this situation, we cannot charge for our time. So in our view, it is easier to just conduct a meaningless interview where we send the agenda and ask the examiner, what do you think? And then they answer, and then that's the end of the interview, basically. どうぞ。
ある出願人は、そのインタビューにかかるコストとしてすごい低い、フィーを、要求することがあります。その典型的な費用の 50% くらいしか払いたくないという人がいます。でも、そのタイムチャージは基本的に、インタビューをスケジューリングしたり、そのアジェンダを用意したりとかするのにその、費用が使われます。そしてアメリカの代理人たちは、インタビュー、この出願人に対してインタビューには加わらないです。それはそのタイムチャージの、中にはその含まれてないからです。でもそのインタビューを実施しなかったら、なぜなんかうまくいかなくなったかとかを出願人が聞いてきたりとか、してしまいます。しかしそのインタビューの分をその出願人にその請求することできないからそういうことができないです。
Brian, what does the applicant think about this corrupt situation? Trust me, they know. These decisions come from above the level of the portfolio managers. So the portfolio managers also think this is a silly situation, but they must abide by the rules. So personally, I would not require interviews because it's too inflexible. However, I would probably pre-authorize one interview per office action, okay? If you want to skip an interview, the first action on the merits typically does not require an interview. especially if you tell your attorney to always amend at the first action on the merits. I wouldn't necessarily always amend, but always amending is a much better strategy than always arguing. And so that's actually a pretty reasonable approach. And if you're going to amend at that stage, you really don't need to be asking an examiner, right? And if you don't listen to my advice regarding a preliminary amendment, then you're definitely like amending at every first action. The next best strategy would be to interview the first final office action specifically, okay? The reason is that examiners have personal policies regarding interviews after final, right? Some of them always grant them, some examiners never grant them. And after final interviews are more valuable than non-final interviews. But you don't necessarily know your examiner's policy regarding interviews after final that early in prosecution. So you would need to wait until the final office action and ask. And then if your examiner only accepts interviews after non-final, you can adapt your strategy for your individual case, right? Maybe you will, if you'll only accept them after non-final, now you start interviewing at every non-final office action. If your examiner does accept them after final and you want to save costs, maybe you only interview at final office action. Again, the after final ones are more valuable, but you can't always get them. どうぞ。
わかりました。そうですね。その最初の、拒絶 OA に対してインタビューをすることについて話してたんですけれども、そのなんだったっけ、そのアフターファイナルのインタビューでその審査官がどういう、判断結果を示すかは個々の審査官によってかなり異なるのですけれども、そのアフターファイナル、後のことはその時点ではわからないです。で、アフターファイナル、そうだからその審査官がそのアフターなんだっけ、その最後じゃない拒絶理由の後じゃないとインタビューに応じないような人だと困ったことになります。
Right. So to ensure value to the applicant, right, because I'm supposed to be the applicant, I would require a form be completed for data gathering. And in this form, I would have questions like who provided the arguments, right? Were they from us, the applicant, or did the Ben-Rishi provide them, or did the U.S. attorney provide them? Were those arguments effective? Who provided the amendments? Were the amendments effective? What was the examiner's interpretation? Whoops. And in some cases, right, this is going to be the examiner that proposes the amendments. And in, each ineffective solution provided by the applicant clearly shows value, right? If we can't, if we present these arguments and they're not accepted, that's not a bad outcome. That's actually a good outcome because now we're advancing prosecution more quickly. We're saving money in the long term. But again, your U.S. attorney is comparing your rates to their time charge. And so I would pay slightly more than market rates, maybe $100, to compensate the attorney for their time in completing the form. It is additional work, but the value you're going to get from this when you can start aggregating the data and looking at, hey, our company's arguments aren't really effective, or hey, the Ben-Rishi at this intermediary firm aren't providing effective amendments, or hey, my U.S. attorney, this U.S. attorney is providing great arguments, like maybe we should give him more cases. That data is very worthwhile for you. どうぞ。
はい。その価値を、調べるために、そのデータを収集することを、おすすめします。その誰がその意見書を用意したかとか、その提出した、反論とかが効果があったかどうか、それから、補正は誰が補正書を作ったか、それからその補正した内容は効果があったかどうかとか、そういうその審査官はどのように判断したかとか、そういうふうな情報についてそのデータをまとめることをお勧めしています。それでそれらの結果が良い人だから、良い、働きをした人がよりたくさんそれに対する、支払いとか、それに対する価値を評価されて、よりたくさんペイされるようになっていきます。
はい。So let's look at a budgeting strategy briefly. So what else can we do? Well, we can tell our U.S. firm that we refuse to work with first or second year associates, okay? We can't prevent that these associates still might be ghostwriting work, right? By ghostwriting, I mean that the second year associate writes the response, but the partner signs the response, and therefore it looks like the partner has written the response. There's no real way to prevent that, but it does increase the accountability of the firm, right? Because now we see a partner's name on this, and if we know that this work is below a partner level, if it looks like it's a second year quality of work, it makes it easier for us to move on from that firm and find different attorneys. In addition, I would look for a tiered flat fee system, okay? These are just some suggestions for numbers. Different companies have different numbers. But I would typically have something like an easy level of amendment for maybe, I don't know, $1,250. This is going to be things like accepting allowable subject matter without office action analysis, filing a terminal disclaimer, something like that. We don't want to overpay for those. We'll have a medium case rate that's, most cases, an art rejection, maybe a brief eligibility rejection. And then we'll have a hard level too, maybe $2,500 or so. And here we're going to have, multiple rejections per independent claim, right? Sometimes examiners have two completely different rejections of one independent claim. Those are terrible. You have very difficult eligibility rejections, more so than the typical eligibility rejection maybe. And so in this situation, the main point is to avoid overspending on the easy responses while permitting and basically rewarding our attorneys for extra effort when it's necessary, right? We don't want to force them to take a hard case and perform it in the same amount of time that they perform a typical case. We want to say, okay, in rare situations, we'll pay for a little bit more time because, we still want a higher quality of response. We're saving money on the easy part. どうぞ。
ブライアン先生のご提案によると、ルーキーのアソシエイトで、つまり1年目とか2年目とかのアソシエイトの代理人さんにお仕事してもらうのはちょっとやめてもらって、だからそういうのでゴーストライティング、代わりにプロフェッショナルの代理人さんの代わりにゴーストライティングしてるような人による、お仕事をしてもらうのをやめてもらったらどうかっていう話をしてました。でケースにもいろんな場合があって、すごい簡単な場合には$1,250ぐらいの、費用でできるし、中ぐらいの難しさだったら$2,000ぐらいでできるし、すごい難しいケースだと$2,500ぐらいかかるかもしれないけど、それぞれの場合にいつも全力でやるのではなく、簡単なケースでは無駄な労力をかけるのではなく、 その必要な努力がすごい大きな努力が必要な案件に対してはそれなりの、努力をしてもらうようにしてっていうふうにその臨機応変に対応してもらうのがいいのではないかという話をしてました。
So the point is that what a reasonable applicant should do is incentivize the U.S. attorneys to do the work that the applicant wants. Yes, in some ways this strategy might be more expensive. でも、attorneys always want to work with reasonable clients. So if the applicant is being reasonable and the attorney for some reason is unreasonable, if they're not giving you good quality work, even though you're paying, high rates, it is so easy to find a new, more reasonable attorney, okay? You do not have to stick with someone who isn't performing for these high rates that we're suggesting. You can save a lot of money by finding someone who will do a better job. There'll be attorneys who are very excited to accept these high levels of pay, and that's how you save money, is by having fewer office actions and making your attorneys happy. どうぞ。
はい。だからその一番、出願人にとって合理的な方法っていうのはどういう方法でしょうっていう話をしてましたけれども、そうですね、その米国代理人さんにとっても、彼らはやはりその合理的に考えてくれるクライアントと一緒にそのコリーグとして働きたいものですっていう話をしてました。だからその、出願人が、どんなにその合理的にそのお仕事を依頼してても、代理人側に何か非合理的な風な、振る舞いがあるとうまくいかないですよね。だからそういう場合にはその今使ってる現存の代理人に固着してしまうのではなく、新しい代理人探しをしてみたらどうでしょうって。そしたらより合理的で一緒に協力して働いてくれる代理人さんがきっと見つかるでしょうという話をしていました。
And that concludes it. Do you have any
questions?
questions?
Yeah, thank you for the wonderful contents. I really appreciate hearing your seminars.
Thank you.
So, as a result, your suggestion is finding a new attorney who can work reasonably each other between the attorney and the applicant.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's I would say that's where I see a lot of problems with for Japanese clients, is they're used to accepting low quality work, and there are a lot of U.S. attorneys who'd be able to provide a lot better service if you gave them an opportunity.
もうなんかこれまでの関係性とかもあるから、なかなかアメリカの代理人に不平とか文句を言うのって難しいと思うんですよね。だからそういうことってしていいんですかね。I wonder that Japanese clients tend to think it is a very good thing, and they think it is important to keep a good relationship with current attorneys. They want to keep on working with the current attorneys, but sometimes they have some complaints. They want to say something to be more nice to them, but they refuse to do so because they sometimes feel it's rude to say something like that, or they will feel like that they will break down the relationship between the United States attorney and the Japanese attorneys. What do you think about it?
I wouldn't even worry about it. American clients fire us all the time without explanation. Suddenly, they'll move their entire docket of cases. Like, American clients don't even complain. They just move the cases one day and you're like, Well, so, you know, that a Japanese applicant or a law firm would even take the time to complain, to give the firm an opportunity to set it straight would be amazing. Even that's kind. I mean, I often solicit feedback from my Japanese clients and I say, like, are we doing an okay job? You know, please let me know. Because if I'm falling short, I need you to tell me. I'm used to American clients just leave. So for them, I have to ask ahead of time before they leave, are we doing okay? So I think it's fine if Japanese applicants complain, but, you know, I'm not sure how much that's going to ultimately change the relationship for the better. Not because the Americans will be upset, but because this is someone that's already failing for you. And I just think it's, you know, if they were the type of people to not fail, if they were the type of people to take your client or your cases seriously, then I don't think they would be in this position in the first place. So I don't think it will necessarily improve the relationship because maybe the U.S. attorney is just taking advantage of you, right? I mean, it's not necessarily going to, the problem won't necessarily go away simply because you've raised the concern.
なんかアメリカ代理人に対して不平があるときはどんどん言ってはどうではないでしょうかという話でした。その不平をなんかあまり言わずに我慢して今の代理人を使い続けるよりも不平をどんどん言ってこういうとこ改善をしてほしいということを伝えた方がより良い関係性を築けるのではないかという話をしてました。I have one more question. Japanese people, including me, tend to think that if the Japanese client give United Attorneys 50 cases, and then it is very polite to give back 50 cases, and it makes a relationship. Is this kind of thinking very common in your United States as well? Like
reciprocity.
Yeah,
of course. I mean, we love to do it, but a lot of us can't.
Can't. Why is that?
Because we don't have American clients. You know, some of us are receiving offices, some of us are sending offices. I mean, I know firms in the U.S. that refuse to accept inbound work from foreign countries, but they will send United States work outside to foreign countries. Different firms do it differently. The one thing, you know, I'm biased because I'm mostly a receiving office. I don't have the ability to offer reciprocity. But from my point of view, which is biased, but also well recognized in the American legal ethics, is this idea that, you know, attorneys shouldn't be concerned with what makes them money. They should be concerned with the quality of the representation for their client, right? So for example, sometimes European firms are very into reciprocity. And from the American point of view, at least at the academic, not necessarily at the business-oriented point of view, at the academic point of view, we think the Europeans might be making bad decisions for their clients because they just want to receive more money from the American applicants. So there's nothing wrong with someone doing both. And, you know, when I have that opportunity to send cases to Japan, I'm trying to do, you know, return favors. But I think as someone that mostly works as a receiving office, my job is to make you look good in front of your clients. Your clients, you know, you might not receive as much work from me, but you might receive more work from your clients because you've got, you know, someone handling them very well on the American side of the prosecution.
わかりました。そのアメリカの代理人とヨーロッパの代理人ではちょっと考え方が違ったりとかすることが、大いにあるようで、その物々交換的な考え方ももちろん大事なんですけど、それだけじゃなくて、 ブライアン先生の考えによると、代理人はやはりその質の良いサービスを提供するのがお仕事なので、そのお仕事をたくさんもらえるようにその仕事するというよりも、クオリティの高い仕事を、クライアントに提供することによって次の仕事をもらえるようにやってるので、なんかそれだけじゃないですよっていう話をしてくれました。Thank you for the nice seminar today.
ありがとうございます。
If you are interested in, we can try to contact you and have a business meeting, customized meeting, or the meetings, seminars, whichever you want. So please ask us to visit your firm and companies if you want. So thank you for listening today.
Bye.
See you.